Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss part 2 of Middlemarch. If you've already watched part 1, you know that this video is going to be full of spoilers, so do not watch this video if you don't want to be spoiled. This is more a video for people who are reading the book at the same time or have already read the book and want to refresh this memory. So let's get into it. Now, part 2, and again, I'm reading my computer. Part 2. So the Middlemarch tensions continue as the decision has to be made about who will head the new hospital. So when Lydgate came into town in part 1, he was here to really refresh and innovate the medical industry, and he is going to be one of the nominated people to head this new hospital. So Lydgate, who is nominated by the character Bulstrode, which we actually meet or we hear of him and meet for a little bit in part 1. But Lydgate, with his new medicine, basically what they're saying, so his new techniques, his new practice, is going against the nomination of Mr. Tyke, who is the selection of a certain Fairbrother, who is considered the safe decision just because he's been here for a long time, but his treatments are fairly outdated. So there's a really big theme in Middlemarch about new versus old, which comes into the topic of like the medical system, this hospital system, the characters, sort of older characters versus younger characters. Also in the background, there's this political background with try and go through reforms so we can improve, and basically just a hesitation for people to go towards progress. So it's a big theme of just within Middlemarch are those, and it's something you have to watch out for. But it's what makes a lot of this really, really interesting outside of the relationships. So we get to know a little bit about Lydgate because we don't learn much about him in part 1. And it is very much assumed that he's part of this very bourgeois, very aristocratic family, even though no one knows his relations, because he came here with no connections. So we are assuming that, and we find out a little bit in part 2 that Lydgate was, in his youth, had pursued this actress in Paris. He sees her in a theater, in a play, and then there's a strange incident where the actress accidentally stabs her partner in the play and actually kills him. And she flees because it turns out that man was her husband. Now she is declared innocent, but when Lydgate goes to find her again in Paris, she says, actually it wasn't an accident, I did it on purpose. And Lydgate decides to renounce on love at that time. So we know he's had a little bit of a past like that. So now we need to learn a little bit more about Bulstrode. Bulstrode apparently had arrived in Middlemarch 20 years ago. Again, no one knows his origins. He came here to marry Mr. Vincey's sister, which allows him to ally himself with a very important, respectable family. So again, this time, and even now, society is all about the connections you can make, which families you can connect with to sort of upgrade your social class and reputation. He is very much, because he is a banker and he's in the financial part of Middlemarch, he's very much well aware of what's going on in the Middlemarch community, because he can keep track of their finances, and because of that, he is able to use that to manipulate and spread his own motivations and intentions, and to sort of create influence on basically this community. So he's definitely, you'll see him a lot throughout Middlemarch, where he is definitely pulling the strings on a lot of things. You'll see his influence quite a bit, but it does make it really, really fun. We go back to Fred and his debts. Fred admits to his father, he doesn't admit to his father. He tells his father about the rumor of his debts. He does lie to his father, but he is able to get a sort of, a letter of denial written by Mr. Bulstrode himself, saying Fred doesn't have any debts. So Fred is able to keep his reputation, and it's only the people who are directly involved with his debts himself that are aware. So we are able to save Fred's reputation a little bit, but it is questionable about where Fred is going to go from here if he's already in this sort of like disastrous situation for him. Let's see, we again go back to the relationship between Fred and the young Mary Garth, and where Fred asks her to promise to marry him. She refuses. She says that he needs to prove himself as someone who's not an idol, that he's not a good for nothing. She thinks he needs to get an education. She thinks he needs to experience the world. And the last thing he needs to be is what his father wants to be, is a clergyman. His father thinking that if he becomes a clergyman, at least he'll have a job, a respectable job, and he won't get into trouble anymore. But most people are well aware that Fred is not really, that's not what he should become. It's not really appropriate for him. So so instead she again refuses to encourage his marriage prospects, and so Fred basically, sorry, I'm reading the summary in front of me. Fred goes home and he asks his mother to hold some money that he received to kind of help him not spend it. In the meantime, we go to Rome, where we are led to a crying Dorothy. She's in a museum and she's crying, and she is a man called Will Ladislaw observes her crying, and his friend Nauman become interested in her. Nauman is just a brief character who's used as an excuse to create the connection between the initial connection between Ladislaw and Dorothy. But even though Nauman was the one who's like, oh, that girl's really pretty, like, I want to get to know her, the importance is Ladislaw and Dorothy and the initial reaction that will lead to the rest of the major plot points in Middlemarch. And so we create the first initial connection between Ladislaw and Dorothy, and we come to see that Dorothy's crying was because of her getting the first emotions coming from the fact she's like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have gone through this marriage. Maybe I made the wrong choice. So that's where we leave off part 2. Let's get into the quotations or the passages that I thought were interesting. So once again, hopefully the last video went well. The quotes will be here so you can read them, pause them, if you would prefer to read them yourself. So in chapter 16, it says, "It was a principle with Mr. Bulstrode to gain as much power as possible, that he might use it for the glory of God. He went through a great deal of spiritual conflict and inward argument in order to adjust his motives and make clear to himself what God's glory required." So if you're familiar with my channel and you're familiar with things I've had to say previously, you'll know that I'm very much against organized religion. Don't really like religion, even if it's not organized, just any of it. I very much dislike the hypocrisy of it and how people use their connection with God, or they use the presence of God to create excuses for their poor actions. I just think it's very, very hypocritical, and I think this was a wonderful line that showed that hypocrisy. Like someone who is basically doing a sin of greed, and what is it? Ego. There's a sin for ego, is there? Well, mostly greed, I would say, but yeah, just greed, but still using God's glory as an excuse for him to be greedy, basically. So I thought that was a very, very adept quote, a very appropriate quote, and I really enjoyed that. Then one page later, it says, George Eliot writes, "Whatever was not problematical and suspected about this young man, Lydgate, for example, a certain showiness as to foreign ideas and a disposition to unsettle what had been settled, and forgotten by his elders as positively unwelcome to a physician whose standing had been fixed 30 years before by a treatise on meningitis, of which at least one copy, marked own, was bound in calf. So here we are, George Eliot is showing the theme of the young versus established. So you have the young litigate with his new techniques, his new ideas that seem very radical, very unsafe, very egotistical, and against these physicians who are very well established, but they use old treatments, they don't really work. It's very old-fashioned. They've been proven to be wrong, but these, you know, they're respected. They've written something on meningitis, and it's like no one's read it, but just because they've written it, they think they're these elite, intelligent beings that must be respectful just because they've been in the practice for 30 years. So we're familiar with these kind of egos, and George Eliot writes formidably about them, and I just think it's absolutely remarkable. Then again, same chapter, chapter 16, 2 pages later after that, this was one of the difficulties of moving in good Middlemarch society. It was dangerous to insist on knowledge as a qualification for any salaried office. And I thought that was hilarious. So witty. The idea that, yeah, if you're knowledgeable and you're intelligent and you have new ideas, you're actually unfit for this position. And yeah, that's very much Middlemarch society. And I thought that was fantastic. So witty. On the same page, she writes, certainly small feet and perfectly turned shoulders aid the impression of refined manners, and the right thing said seems quite astonishingly right when it is accompanied with exquisite curves of lip and eyelid. I love George Eliot's impression of a male being impressed by a woman, where her thoughts, yeah, they're fine, but only if they're enhanced by immeasurable beauty. Like, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Really love that. And then finally, chapter 17, but a good wife, a good unworldly woman, may really help a man and keep him more independent. So throughout Middlemarch, like I said, I have read ahead, but throughout Middlemarch, George Eliot often makes these little quips about what society considered to be a good woman. And she's so witty about it. She always adds this really nice, sarcastic tone to all of it. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. All right, so that is part 2. I hope you're still enjoying it, and I will see you in part 3.